closed positions are often the hardest to play. This is because they involve the use of key skills such as patience and the ability to come up with plans that open positions typically don't require as much. That's why beginners tend to perform much better in open positions instead of closed positions. But the truth is, to play good in closed positions is not actually as hard as it seems. So in today's video, we'll be looking at a perfect instructive game that shows exactly how you should look to play in these types of closed positions. So we'll be looking at this game from Black's perspective, and the opening is not as important because closed positions can arise from many different openings. So we'll kind of skim through these moves, and we'll get to the important part, which you can start to see the closed position begin to form right around here, and now with the extra move G4, it starts to become a much more closed position, and this is kind of where we'll begin. So first of all, how do I know this is a relatively closed position? Well, typically the pawn structure is the biggest giveaway. Notice that these pawns, they're not, there's no tension between them. No pawn can really take another pawn, and therefore the position is kind of locked and it's very still. And so what should you look to do in these closed positions? Well, the first important tip that I would recommend is take one of your worst pieces, a piece that is doing nothing for you, and improve it. And so, for example, here, after the move knight to g1, Black noticed that this rook is really doing nothing. There's no pressure on this pawn. There's no need to defend it. There's no real need to patrol this 6th rank, as white is not really threatening anything on the 6th rank. So, for the most part, the rook is not doing anything. That is why rook to g6 was played. This very simple move makes the rook a lot more useful. Now it is actually threatening to simply take the pawn, right? Because there's too many attackers on this pawn and not enough defenders, so you're simply threatening to take the pawn, and it's improving the rook, even if it doesn't seem like it does that much, because, hey, white can defend. It still makes this rook that used to be very passive a bit more active, and now this rook has suddenly become much more passive. So by starting to put pressure on your opponent, you're also making their position become a lot more passive. Here, we can say the same thing about this queen. Notice that this queen here is not really doing anything. Again, no need to control this 6th rank. And again, this pawn is a pretty big weakness. So queen to g8. Again, just simply to put more pressure onto this pawn. And notice that it is quite important to identify these weaknesses. And so, for example, these pawns are not really weak at all because they're defended by other pawns. But when you look at this pawn, or even really this pawn, all of these pawns cannot be defended by other pawns, and therefore they're very good targets to try to attack. The reason Black chose to attack this pawn here is that most of Black's pieces are already towards this area. It will take a lot longer to transition towards this area of the board, even though it is possible to attack this pawn later. There's no need to move all of your pieces there if you've already have a perfectly good target to try to attack. So queen to g8, going for the pawn, and now the move knight to e2 was played. To, again, just simply defend the pawn. And notice, again, this knight is quite passive. It's stuck. It can't move. If it ever tries to move, then this pawn will be lost. Now, if we quickly pause here, what Black has done so far is add a lot of pressure to this pawn. But realistically, how do you continue to add pressure? It's very difficult to get this last final piece to a square where it can add pressure. It'll take too long, and it's very unnecessary. You need a different way to attack or break through in a position like this. And so what you should be looking, once all of your pieces are kind of maximized and are in their best positions for attacking, you want to look, where are you strongest? And clearly that is here in the king side. And so then you want to try to open up files for your pieces. So for example here, all of your pieces are on one file, which makes it very clear what file you should try to open, this G file. In fact, if this pawn wasn't here, pretend the pawn's missing, then I'm sure that there's already some sort of big attack, maybe even checkmate. For example, maybe rook h4 check. Again, because you're controlling the file. The point that I'm trying to make is that you're very strong along this file. So opening up the file is a very good plan. So what you should look to do here is, for example, h5, which is actually the only way to try to chip away at this pawn and open it up. Even if you end up sacking the pawn, which you won't really need to because your rook can take, it's fine because you're opening up all of your pieces, which otherwise are simply staring at your opponent's pawn, and you cannot continue to add pressure. So h5, h4, and now rook to h1. Notice that here the pawn's pinned, but it still puts pressure on this pawn, so you can actually just take here. And, you know, after all of these trades, you know, again, the pawn defends the queen, even though it's pinned, it still supports the queen, so the king can't take. So that would have been possible. But in the game, instead, a much more safe option, rook to h6, just to unpin the pawn and, you know, keep it in a powerful position. Here, the move rook to h3 was played, and look at white's pieces. So passive here, all along the third rank with the aim of defending this pawn. I mean, all of these pieces here are tied down to the defense of the pawn. It looks very sad here. But again, how do you continue to break open the position? Well, in a position like this, it's actually quite difficult, because even though all of these white pieces are very stuck, they're very kind of smushed together, it's hard to continue to make progress. And so this is where flexibility comes into play. You can't really continue to attack this pawn here, so the move queen to g6 was played. Why? Because the queen is going straight to the queen side with queen to a6 here. And the point is, this pawn is a very big weakness. It's one of the weaknesses that I identified when I looked at these weak pawns. And before, it didn't make much sense to attack it because you were putting pressure here. But now that this attack is kind of slowed down, it's a perfect time to strike on the other side of the board. So queen to a6, going for the a2 pawn, but also setting up a small little tactical idea here. So try to find, if it was black to move here, try to find a really cool idea here that wins a lot of material. But moving back to the game, the main purpose is to simply attack this pawn, and it's very hard to defend it. For example, the move knight to c1, well, notice that now you've kind of relieved too much pressure away with this bishop blocking the queen, and now with this knight moving back, there's just not enough support on this pawn. So in this position, simply taking the pawn works, you know, wonderfully. They can take the rook. It doesn't really matter, because in the end, you're going to have enough pieces to, of course, just win the rook. And if they decide to take the pawn with the rook, this doesn't really matter either. You can trade, and here, after the king moves somewhere, I'm sure that there's a checkmate here, or at least a very nice attack. Your queen and rook are completely dominating these open files. So back to the game, it's not really an option to defend the pawn with the knight, and there's no other way, so white simply gives away this pawn, and now that you've finally chipped away at these weaknesses, you've opened up this file, now your pawn can simply run to the end of the board, and that is kind of what happened in the game. Black is simply going to promote here, there's nothing you can do, and white resigned. So a really beautiful game showing you how you have to be ready to play on both sides of the board. You have to be flexible, and also you have to identify the big weaknesses that exist on both sides of the board. And again, be ready to be flexible and attack them both. And also the ability to open up files for your pieces, even in close positions, right? So even in a position like this, which looks relatively closed, there's always these pawn breaks. Even if they look crazy right now, there's always these pawn breaks that at some cases, if all of your pieces are being ready to use those open files, could be something you should consider. And so always keep your eye open for these pawn breaks. And again, position your pieces at the best squares that they can be. Thank you all for watching this video. Make sure you guys like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more videos like these, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.